Hello and welcome to You Can Grow Your Own Way, a conversation for parents and carers of neurodivergent children. I feel so privileged you are taking time out of your busy life to learn all about the ways to interpret neurodivergence for you and your child. Remember, all advice on this podcast is general and may not specifically apply to your child, so we encourage you to also talk to your GP, paediatrician or specialist to see if what you've learned will help your family. Hello, I'm Carly, and this is You Can Grow Your Own Way, a conversation for parents and carers of neurodivergent children. Today, we're going to be speaking to Helen Graham, the Chief Executive Officer of Autism South Australia, about all things autism. Today was an incredibly amazing conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to Helen. You could see the passion and dedication that she has for empowering the autism community. And I walked away from our conversation with the biggest smile on my face. It just felt so positive to know that there were people who were representing the community in this way. I'm really excited to bring this discussion to you, and I hope you get as much out of it as I did. Helen Graham is currently the Chief Executive Officer for Autism South Australia. Helen brings a wealth of energy and experience from previous roles within Autism South Australia at Good Prospect Speech Pathology and Psychology and Mission Australia. Helen also holds a Bachelor of Psychology with honours. Helen found her niche when she started working with autistic clients and now feels strongly about the advocacy role that she is privileged to have as CEO of Autism South Australia. I am going to try that again. A smidge faster. All right. Helen Graham is currently the Chief Executive Officer at Autism South Australia. She brings a wealth of energy and experience from previous roles at Autism South Australia, Good Prospect Speech Pathology and Psychology, and Mission Australia. Helen also holds a Bachelor of Psychology with honours. Helen found her niche when she began working with autistic clients, and she feels strongly about the advocacy role that she is privileged to have as CEO of Autism South Australia. And now, let's get into our chat. Good morning, Helen. I'm so thrilled to have you here on You Can Grow Your Own Way. It's amazing to have the CEO of Autism South Australia. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I actually wanted to ask you, what a big position, what an important role, CEO of Autism South Australia, I should say. What actually excited and interested you to get into the position?
So I've always sort of worked in the space really for my last 20 years, working in community services, employment services, disabilities employment services, and then become a psychologist and started working in private practice, and started working with lots of kids and adults and families that were on the spectrum somewhere. Mm-hmm. And really fell in love with the cohort of people, and so went actively searching for a role here at Autism SA, and was lucky enough to start in the positive behavioural support and school space. And then when this opportunity came up, I went through a very rigorous recruitment process, and I'm glad I did, because I remind myself every day of the privilege of being here, and the biggest privilege of it all is that I get to hear everybody's stories, and something I loved about working in the psychology space. So yeah, I get to hear it here as well.
Fantastic. How beautifully personal. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
So, big meaty question for our very first question. How do we define autism?
Yeah, well, look, it's a funny one in the sense that it really depends the lens that you're coming from. And if I think about how we define it, so how Autism SA really have come together with our cohort and our community, and really to develop what we think is a really good definition of autism. We talk about it being a neurodevelopmental difference that impacts how an autistic person perceives and experiences and understands and responds to the world around them. And we know that every person lived experience of autism is quite different. Then you've got kind of the neurodiversity movement, and they define autism, as a diverse fabric of the human genome, and that should be celebrated.
Mm.
And then you've got sort of that clinical criteria that comes out of the diagnostics manual, which is more around a neurodevelopmental disorder, which is where you hear the term autism spectrum disorder. So there's lots of different definitions that you hear, but we here at Autism SA, we talk about it being a developmental difference, really, that impacts the way an autistic person perceives the world around them.
Beautiful. I love that word difference because it isn't a positive or a negative thing. It allows somebody to put their own experience
Correct.
into how they use the world.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah,
fabulous.
absolutely. And, we've got quite a population. We know that, one in every 91 people, so it's what, 1.1%. It's quite a little bit higher than it's been in the past.
Mm.
1.1% of the population are autistic. So, that's quite a community now.
It most definitely is, and they're definitely identifying and, feeling a lot prouder of that representation than they have had before, which is an amazing place to be. So,
Absolutely.
I feel
Yes.
incredibly privileged actually to be raising a son in a space where the message is changing as much as it is. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, when we're moving away from this idea of, just inclusivity, because that's important, but it's about value. Value.
Mm,
That's the most
mm.
important part of what we try and do here.
Beautiful, beautiful. So, what do you think are some common myths that are often represented around autism? Or another way of phrasing that is like, what isn't autism?
Yeah. It's funny because uh, there's so many, and so when I was thinking about this when we were talking just before, I thought what I'd do is I just capture some of the ones that kind of I hear in conversation, and you probably hear as well, as a parent. This idea that only boys are autistic.
Mm, hmm.
We know that there are a number of girls and women receiving a diagnosis, and that's increasing now. But that's been for a long time. There was this idea that it was a boys only diagnosis. That only children are autistic is another big myth. The idea that once you become an adult, you grow out of autism, and yet we know that it's a lifelong spectrum. And importantly, we know that more and more now adults are seeking an autism diagnosis, and that's increasing significantly. Again, as I said, the concept of people growing out of autism is because people don't really understand that you are born autistic and you'll pass away autistic. It's because
Hmm.
it's a lifespan.
Yes.
Um, the other thing that I think I hear commonly is, what's your special ability, or what's your talent, or
Yes.
like there's this assumption that every autistic person must have this special, thing that they can do better, a bit Sheldon-esque, if you will, from the Big Bang Theory. And that's
Yes.
really frustrating for autistic people, particularly because it is based on sort of a TV show. And I know it's human behavior to try and relate to something that you know and recognize. And so if the only exposure you have is via a TV show, that's probably what you're doing. But for autistic people, this expectation that you'll be brilliant or dazzle them at something, is a bit frustrating.
I love that
And I
because when sorry, I'm just interrupting you there, Helen. I just wanted to
Yeah,
share
you're
though,
right.
when
Yeah.
we actually told a particular family member about Mr. Eight's diagnosis, the first thing he said was, "Oh, well, at least that means he'll be really great at working in computers."
Oh yes.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm.
Yeah, I know. And it's and you know that people are trying to give you a positive, but what you're really asking for is just value my person as who they are.
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct.
yeah.
Exactly.
And it's interesting because that those sort of stereotypes around the types of jobs that autistic people can do, um, or that autistic people don't want friends,
Mm.
or they don't want relationships. There's some of those myths that lots of autistic people seek out social connections. So yeah, quite interesting. And I think the other big myth is that autism is a mental health condition.
Mm.
We know that lots of autistic people have co-occurring mental health conditions,
Mm.
but that's certainly not the case.
No, no, it literally is in the foundation of how the brain functions and in their neural network. So, yeah,
Yeah,
it's not something that we're going to be able to solve with lots of therapy, or we can provide tools, we can provide equipment, we
yeah,
can provide scaffolding, but yeah, it's not solvable per se, which is actually
yeah.
a terrible thing to think.
And Autism SA, we consider ourselves a neuroaffirming practice, and we get that from the voice of our community. And in a lot of years in the past, we saw a curative approach to autism,
Mm.
where how do we solve it, how do we cure it, and there was that period of time where there was puzzle pieces and all sorts. And what our autistic community have actually told us is that, unlike other disabilities, this is my identity. It's an identity first disability, and I am an autistic person. I am autistic. And that is really different to what we see in the broader disability community, where often people want to be known as a person first, not necessarily a disability. And so I think that takes some adjustment for people. And so then we move away from this idea of, treatments or interventions, and we look at what support do you need as an autistic person to achieve whatever your life plan is, whatever your goal is. And when we talked before about the different lenses, when we look at it from that lens, it allows the autistic person really to tell us and lead us about what supports they need so they can enjoy life in a way that they want to enjoy life, not how we think a person should. So that's really important, I think.
I've seen a beautiful example of that this morning, actually. I got a message from my son's school, and we went to go and see the NGV Pharaoh exhibition, he and I, on Wednesday. So we travelled down on the train. We went through busy Melbourne, which is a lot for him. He was very excited. One of his beautiful little hyper-focuses is Egypt. He adores Egyptian mythology, so he was super excited. Funnily enough, in the exhibition, found it mega overwhelming. We had to scoot through it in about 30 minutes. It was a bit too much for him.
Yeah.
And so he slept on the train on the way back. He was all over the shop yesterday, and he's gone into class today, and he's gone into their little quiet space, and he's actually curled up under a blanket and he's gone to sleep.
Oh, bless.
Bless, I know, right? And I mean, credit to
I'm just a little bit jealous that I
safe.
can't curl up and have a sleep.
Yeah, and they've let him as well. There
that.
is no judgment. There's no interruption. They've checked in with me on when we think he should probably wake up, so we make sure that he actually manages to get to sleep tonight. But that beautiful experience of the school just accepting for exactly what he is and fulfilling what he needs, I think, is an incredible lens that we're existing in at the moment. We're not kicking him to sick bay. We're not telling him that he has to stay awake. He's just allowed to do what his body needs to do, and I just think that that's magical.
Yeah, I love that. What an amazing school. I love that.
We are very lucky, very lucky. I say that all the time.
It's funny because our autism inclusion minister would say, our autism assistant minister, would say, it's not luck that you get a good teacher. It should be the standard. And she's really, really passionate about that. And so we work side by side with her on all sorts of those really important statements, because we hear lots of our parents of our autistic kids say, I'm really lucky. And you know what? It just shouldn't be like that. It should, if we were to put that in a different environment, we would never expect someone to be lucky to have a ramp. And yet we're kind of experiencing people that use wheelchairs are still saying, there's no way to get into this building. And, we know that's unacceptable and we want to make change. So in the flip side, the reverse of that in the autism space is it shouldn't be around luck for your little man. It should be around, the minimum standard of inclusion and value.
I absolutely love that. Thank you. That's a beautiful thing to say. I think that's what a lot of parents believe. Not always what we see, and it's a big fight in front of us. But it's an amazing place to have as our expectation, because then it's a goal to meet. And I really appreciate that. I know how much work, and I suppose one of the things when I say luck, I know how much work my school is actually doing to bring themselves into that space, and that's not always the case, that it comes from leadership down to create that vision. And so I suppose we also are doing a lot of work with the school, and we did a lot of work to choose the school. So you're right, it does take that luck away from it. But we are lucky that we have people who are in the headspace of being in the position that you're talking about. And
it's around that gratefulness, isn't it?
Exactly. I think gratitude, that's the perfect word for it.
Yeah.
So look, I'm aware that we're going to have parents coming to this conversation who have quite young children. But we'll also have parents coming to this conversation who have teenagers, and they may have had a teacher or a kindergarten teacher or even a GP or a family member say, hey, have you seen this? I wonder if this is. So how does autism often display at different ages and stages of life? So as a parent, how do we feel like we can look at particular scenarios and say, maybe it's worth having a conversation to help empower our child with a diagnosis?
Yeah, it's really tricky, isn't it, as a parent, because you get lots of input and feedback about your parenting, sometimes unsolicited feedback and input. But I think some of the important ones are really when we see people who are exposed to children at a certain age, or to milestones at a certain age. And so that's when I talk about teachers a lot, because as a parent, we might have only one child in the house of that age, and so we might not see a delay in anything. But parents, teachers have the capacity to look at things side by side. So they might see a difference in your child's social communication or their social interaction. It might be that they recognise that your child gets a little bit overwhelmed with too much noise or too much light, or, they really have, they need to have some form of sensory something like a stim or something like that. And so because they can look at children side by side and they see a variety of children, they're able to start to probably look at things that are a little bit different to what other kids are doing in terms of development. And so that space, I think, is that age group in terms of school, particularly in primary school, in the early years of primary school, is when we start to see some of those behaviours, because we've got other kids we can compare against now.
Yeah. Yep.
And so that's really important. The thing that I would talk to parents about the most, and often get asked about, and I talk to them about the developmental milestones. Is your baby looking at you when you make a noise, and are they reacting the same way as your other children might have at those same ages? And at the end of the day, if you're curious, I think the best thing you can do is really reach out to your pediatrician or to your GP. And if for lots of people, they can't get into a pediatrician or they can't get into a GP, we've got a website called The Spectrum. So thespectrum.org, and on there is a whole list of things, a checklist of things that you might want to look at, depending on the age of your child or even yourself, that you might want to look at. But it really comes down to, if you're curious, find a specialist that can support you through those things. What we also find is, for lots of parents, once their children get a diagnosis, they go, that seems familiar. And they start to explore that space for them. And then things really start to fall into place around their own childhood experiences and their own schooling experiences and their own interactions in the workplace. And, so I think it's really important, again, if you're curious, to reach out to somebody that you trust that can guide you through it. Again, there's lots of resources on the website, but just check out and make sure that they're, are the correct sources. But yeah, we also talk about, really going with your gut instinct. As parents, often we kind of get dismissed a little bit. We worry, we panic. And I know we often go to GPs who do a remarkable job, but we expect GPs to know a lot of stuff, and not every GP is across the criteria for autism. And so it's really important that we make sure that we get ourselves informed, and if at all at the end of that we find that we still can't quite understand where to be, there are places you can reach out to. So Amaze, a Victorian organisation, have this amazing hotline called Autism Connect that we're a part of, and you can call that number and they can help guide you through some of those things. So there's lots of supports available.
How fantastic is that? What an amazing place for us to be right now, that we've got that level of availability of information and support.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to connect in, because you did talk about, I suppose parental guilt, and all parents experience it. And sometimes you do hear parents say, I wish I'd worked out that my child had this earlier, or why didn't I notice it when they were younger? And when you're talking about that curiosity and the conscious parenting as well, and being aware of your child, I think it's really important to note that quite often when we're really connected with our child, we unconsciously scaffold and support their behaviour. And so it may not become apparent until they're in a classroom when they're compared with their peers, because what you've been doing is actually making the day-to-day experiences of that child easier for them, which is absolutely incredible. You're supporting their every moment and making sure that they're not feeling out of their skin. So don't feel guilty.
No.
Understand that it actually means that you've been doing an amazing job, and now that they're placed in an environment that's a bit more stimulating, they're needing to then go to that next step to look at a diagnosis. I think that's really important to validate for parents as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. And I have many, many parents approach me with exactly what you've talked about, that sense of guilt around not getting a diagnosis earlier. And my advice is exactly that. From the perspective of parents, you're doing the very best you can with what you've got available to you. And at the end of the day, love is the most important thing.
100%. Yes, exactly. Relationships and connection. We can't go past it.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, we were talking about not wanting to stereotype because it is a
Mhm.
lens, and people are seeing things in different ways. We're also talking about different, and we're going to come to a question here about level 1, level 2, and level 3, and I know how that sits in the community. But, we talk about the spectrum in the range of different complexities that different autistic people experience. Um, but let's talk about challenges and strengths because they're really helpful, I think, for parents and friends to be able to understand how to assist, support, embrace. So, what do we often see as typical, what we would label as challenges? Because there's kind of no other really, way to get around the word. But those difficulties they may experience in a neurotypical environment.
Yeah, so I think you started in the same place I started, and that is that every person is different,
Mm.
autistic or not autistic. Everyone has their own unique strengths and their own unique skills. Um,
Mm.
so, in terms of challenges that we have for autistic people, what we often hear sort of from autistic adults in particular is more around the comparison to the life stages that perhaps non-autistic people deal with. So it's that lack of understanding from others, and you referred to it before about talking to your family members around your lad, and it's really around or people that are brave enough to talk about being autistic with a space of people that perhaps aren't really in an awareness phase. Uh, that's difficult. That can be tricky. We know that we've got data. Some over 60% of autistic people have lost friends because when they've talked about their autistic diagnosis, people have responded in a way that's really quite unfavourable. You know, almost half the autistic adult population have told us they don't want to leave the house because they're worried about having like negativity towards them because of their autism. And we also know that half of our adults avoid family gatherings because of the way people respond to their autism. So, when I think about challenges, I think people look at me and go, well, what's a challenge of an autistic person? And they'll expect me to talk about, socio-emotional reciprocity and
Mm.
bright lights and noises and things like that. And all of those things are true. But when I look at it from broadly, what do non-autistic people enjoy that autistic people really have to work through all the time? I think about those things, that social isolation, not going to pubs or bars or shops or sporting events because the crowds are too big and the noise is too much, or we have fireworks and all those kinds of different things. So really in South Australia, I think we do a pretty good job at we have started really trying to challenge some of those environments where we can
Mm.
provide sensory spaces and quiet rooms and things where people can decompress if they're too overwhelmed. you know um, and then I think about the workforce, where even within the disability community, employment for autistic people is even harder to get. So it's employment is 3 times lower than other disability types. It's 8 times lower than the general population.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
so so when I think about challenges, I don't automatically go to, some of the things that people would ordinarily tell you about. Sometimes for little kids, it's hard to wear uniforms because of the sensory.
Mhm.
A tag on could send the whole day into a tailspin. So that's
Mhm.
true. That's true. But when I
Mhm.
think about challenges, I think those societal things that people like you and I can make change in, and that really is around providing an opportunity for autistic people because we have value in autistic people. That's what I really see as the answer to that question.
I think that's a really powerful and also a very emotional answer to that question. And I can visualize it at the moment how many parents and carers will have listening to that, nodding along, understanding what their little people have to choose to miss out on because it's too overwhelming. Um, the excursion that we went on Wednesday, my Mr. 8 and I did that together because his school knew that doing it as a school, which they did the week before, was just too much. Now, we were very, and I am going to say lucky here, we were lucky that I'm in the position as someone who has flexible working hours to be able to take my son so that he didn't miss out on that
Yeah,
opportunity. Um,
yeah,
and so having that understood more broadly, especially from that social inclusion aspect. It's huge. It's really huge. And what you're saying there about employment, my gosh, that breaks my heart. It really
Mm.
does. Um,
Yeah,
I was
so
actually, I was at,
employment is hard for autistic people in the sense of getting in the door, right? Because first you got to explode the myth and the stereotype.
mm,
And if you explode that myth and stereotype and would like a job outside of IT, you then have to deal with this recruitment process whereby two people sit down on the either side of the desk, and I've got to wow you with my ability to small talk and provide answers in a moment, and that
eye
social emotional
contact.
reciprocity that's
Yep,
expected, and all of those
yep,
kinds of things,
yep.
and knowing when to laugh, at your joke or whatever. And that's just an unrealistic environment for lots of autistic people. Not all, but lots of autistic people.
Mm. Yeah, I was at something the other day where someone put up their hand and asked a question. It was around psychosocial behaviours in the workplace and awareness of supporting psychosocial issues in the workplace. And someone actually put up their hand and stood up and asked a question and said, "What happens if you employ an autistic person and they get aggressive?"
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I think everyone around me heard me take a really sharp breath in, almost swallow my tongue,
Wow.
um, and be aware that I wasn't the person answering the question. So I couldn't put my hand up and say that that's a myth that we're perpetuating by asking that question in that environment. What it did show me is that that belief is still out there,
Yeah.
which is just horrible.
So we know we've started, but there's still so much to get through in terms of raising awareness and helping people actually understand what autism, and it's that myth we talked about when we began,
Mm.
and the other one is that everybody's on the spectrum somewhere,
Yeah.
which really diminishes
Hmm.
the experience of
Yes.
autistic people. And I understand that everyone's trying to find a way to relate,
Yes.
but the idea that everyone's on the spectrum somewhere really takes away from the fact that it impacts autistic people to the extent that they can't enjoy employment in the way
Yes.
that non-autistic
I
people
often,
can.
I
So I
often
think
try to
that's
explain
important.
it to people when they say it. I'm like, that's like saying to someone who has had their leg amputated that you get it because you've stubbed your toe.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's not the same at all. And look, what we talk to people about is that there are characteristics, but of course we there has to be, you have to meet a criteria, and the criteria is sort of you are or you aren't, right?
Mm.
And people obviously will recognise some characteristics, but that doesn't mean that you meet all of the criteria.
Now, instead of talking about strengths, where we start to get into all those
Okay.
stereotypes, I think what I'd like to actually ask you instead is what are the things you most enjoy about working with the autism community?
Oh, well, that's a big question too. There's a couple of different answers from me. So one of the things that I constantly get overwhelmed by is the resilience of a community who have to really deal with these stereotypes all the time, and they are tenacious.
Mm.
They are unapologetically energetic about being recognised for their value,
Mm.
and I love that. I love I love the fact that the community want to support the community. I'm also constantly overwhelmed at how incredible parents and carers of autistic kids are, because, and I say this often, when all the lights go off in the doctor's surgery, and when all of the therapists go home, and when all of the people like me go off to my, life, the people that are left holding everything are parents, for their autistic kids that are really experiencing autism, particularly in that moment on that day, as really hard. And, as you talked about, what can be a fantastic start to a day can sometimes end in the end of the day in a complete meltdown through no fault of anybody. And it's just that overload, it's just too much. And parents are trying to work through their own lives and then support their autistic child, and then often siblings. who, trying to work out what just went wrong. So I think about that a lot and think that's a cohort of parents that do an incredible job, because we also know that it's an invisible disability. So what happens for parents is they just get judged that their kids are naughty.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I reflect on one of the things we've done recently with the Hotels Association. We engaged a number of venues here in Adelaide to have quiet dinners. And the whole purpose of that was so that autistic adults, autistic parents, parents of autistic kids could go out for dinner, and it was it's like no big loud music in the background. The lights were dim. Even one of the venues changed the way they serve food, so it was on trays that had segments, so the food didn't touch, because that's can be an adverse thing for lots of I can see that you recognize that for autistic kids. They don't like their food touching, they don't like the texture the same. So and that's because for lots and lots of parents, they just go out to dinner, they bundle their kids in the car, and they go out to dinner, and then they go home and everyone goes to bed. For parents of autistic kids, that is not the case. And that is a full event to go out to dinner. And then if you do manage to get there and it's too much for your little one and they have a meltdown, the entire restaurant is judging you for your parenting. And then sometimes it is just not worth the effort.
Mm-hmm.
And so we wanted to change that. And so we did. And we've got amazing venues that are continuing to do that. And I got to sit there with a range of families of autistic parents, parents of autistic kids, autistic adults, and they just ate in quiet. Some stimmed, some used sensory, sensory bowls and all sorts of different things. And it was an amazing opportunity for people just to enjoy. One parent told us they hadn't been out for dinner with their children for 2 years.
Oh, wow.
So when you ask me, what do I like working about this community? That's what I like, that we are making avenues for the autistic community to have voice, to be valued, to be accepted, and for us to recognise that some really, really small tweaks and changes in spaces can allow people to enjoy things they haven't enjoyed for years. And what we do doesn't really impact others in a negative way. In fact, we found a lot of elderly people really enjoyed the quiet dinners because they didn't have to listen to the loud music.
Mm-hmm.
And we found lots of people with hearing impairments enjoyed the quiet dinners because the music wasn't too overwhelming. So, those kinds of changes, and that all come from the autistic people. They helped us design it, they helped us guide us, they give us feedback. We actually had an autistic a hotel owner get involved. They also provided, sensory movies, so that's not so loud. Your kids can get really overwhelmed in the cinema. So those things, that's what I love. The autistic people that we work for and in service of, they tell me what they want, and I try as hard as I can to influence that with the amazing people I've got around me and the amazing clinicians who put it all into practice. And then I get to be on podcasts and talk about it. So
And by sharing this as well, can I just say the other amazing thing is that someone will listen to this, hopefully, hotels, state bodies, councils will hear this and go, hey, we can do that. That's actually not that impossible to implement. I just also want to say, listening to that, Helen, and actually listening to the authenticity with how you delivered that passion of the real lived story, I had tears in my eyes and I had goosebumps. Because it is the lived experience of so many families. And often we sometimes hear platitudes of, oh, you were doing an amazing job, or your kids are so lucky that they've got you as parents, which, by the way, like I hate hearing they're lucky to have you as parents. Like, what? My child is an amazing individual. It doesn't work that way. But we don't hear the actual visibility when people see and understand what the experience is like. So, that it really got me. I'm just going to say that.
I'm glad. I honestly get that feedback from parents so much, and that sits with me every day in every decision I make. And likewise, the autistic adult community tell me exactly what they want in terms of employment and access and inclusion across our societal spaces. And so that's what drives us here. Really important stuff.
Amazing. And so bringing us back to some of the conversations of things that probably feel a little bit loaded or can get quite loaded in the community. I wanted to ask, what was Asperger's syndrome? And
Yeah,
is the
yeah,
term still used? So let's do that separately from the next part of
yeah.
the question, because some
Okay.
people will still use that term and they'll say, oh, I
Mhm.
think that person has Asperger's. By the way, don't ever diagnose somebody else. It's really rude. Um,
So true.
yes,
Yeah.
let's talk about Asperger's.
Yeah. So in 2013, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, which is kind of the manual used across the globe to diagnose a range of psychiatric, neurodevelopmental, and mental health conditions. And in 2013, that moved from Volume 4 to Volume 5.
Mm,
And prior to that, Asperger's syndrome, autistic disorder, and I'm pretty sure it was PDD, were
mm,
diagnosed, and they were removed in DSM-5. So in the updated version, those three, and they were replaced with autism spectrum disorder. Um, so so the terminology of Asperger's syndrome, that diagnosis remains, and for some people that is really important because that diagnosis really validates that person and gives them a strong sense of identity.
mm,
And we still welcome those that wish to use the Asperger's diagnosis. It's just not diagnosed anymore. I think there may have been some conjecture in the community between, an Asperger's diagnosis and others like an autistic disorder or what have you. But I think community members are better to tell you about that than I,
yeah.
because I wasn't really in this space at that time, and I know it's quite a controversial space, and I'm not shying
Mm,
away from it. But I
mm,
think that there was an element of one diagnosis represented autism this way and another diagnosis represented it that way. So I think the idea that we now have an autism spectrum is probably a better example of the range of presentations you see from a diagnostic space. And you will have seen the very famous saying, you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And that really is so true.
mm.
And so that's true of those of that had an Asperger's diagnosis and those that didn't. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a tricky space, and those that still use it. But I think, for our community, it's around being able to use a terminology that you best identify with.
Yeah, beautifully said. And coming into that, looping into that, so
Yeah,
when we're talking about the DSM-5, they use level 1, level 2, and level
yeah,
3.
yeah,
So would you mind high level talking about what that is, and then
yeah,
also talking about what that means for the community?
yeah. So importantly, we have to remember that level 1, level 2, level 3, they're in a diagnostics manual. They're
Mm,
diagnostics terms. And the neuroaffirming community will talk to you a little bit about the concept of those levels not being something they enjoy referring to. Although I do get lots of parents come and talk to me and say, I've got a daughter who's ASD level 3.
mm,
And I don't think by any stretch of the imagination a parent is trying to use that negatively. I think what they're trying to do very quickly is give me a snapshot of
yes,
who their child is and what supports they need, because
correct.
that's what those levels really
Mm,
represent. So the
mm,
levels are a snapshot of the functioning at the time of diagnosis,
mm,
and they range in support needs. So level 1, you require support. Level 2, you require substantial support, and level 3, you require very substantial support. Now, you can see why that might be a little controversial if we're
mm,
talking about levels of support required. And,
mm,
some of the terminology that we've seen change over the years. So in past, you might have heard high functioning or low
mm,
functioning.
mm,
The neuroaffirming movement is very clear that that is not a terminology we use anymore. We like to talk about what your support needs are. So I might have high support needs, or I might have low support needs. And that might change contingent upon my experience of autism. So I might have really competent social communication, but I might have really overwhelming sensory. And so those supports are different in two different spaces.
mm,
So social communication and behaviour. And so the levels are really a diagnostic term, and they get used for diagnostic spaces. They get used as a quick snapshot of the support need. But I think with the intent they use, it's important to acknowledge that they have a purpose. But does that define the person? Absolutely not. Does it help people describe a support need in a moment? Absolutely. So I think that's probably, hopefully I've explained that in a way that kind of covers the whole piece.
Yeah,
But
no, I think you've done a beautiful job explaining that, most definitely. So, it's going to be very useful for talking to NDIS or maybe explaining it when you're looking for an education support for your child at school. But it certainly doesn't provide the breadth of colour that covers your child.
And like any diagnosis, I'm always really hesitant to, so once that label's out there, especially in the schools environment, people start to go, right, this is how that person will react to me. This is how that person will respond to me. And so sometimes we remove the person from that. And so you're right. It is really important when we're trying to access supports and access funding to be able to provide a snapshot of that functioning in that moment. And provided that the very next conversation is about the person or the student, then everything else is okay. Or the employee. So if an employee walks in and tells me what level autism they have, it actually doesn't help me support them in the workplace. My very next question is, okay, so what do you need to be successful and how can I support you with that? And so I think that's the most important part. Levels are good for certain navigation tools, but beyond that, we talk about people.
Beautiful. When we were talking about this earlier before we hit the record button, I was saying to Helen that often when we have conversations, they come to this beautiful point of closure. And to finish with a sentence that says it's actually all about people is the perfect way to finish. If you scripted that, I would be incredibly impressed.
I didn't. It was your amazing interview. Thank you.
Helen, it's been so informative to listen to you talk today. I also, from the perspective of a parent who has an autistic son, it's amazing to hear the guiding light that's coming out of Autism South Australia. It's amazing to hear the changes that are coming out of South Australia. I think you guys are definitely leading the way where it comes to what's going on in the States across Australia. And I certainly hope that more of our governments, more of our councils, more of those in the bureaucratic space take notice of what you're doing in empowering the individualism of people on the autism spectrum. I think it's just incredible. And so with complete heartfelt thanks, I wanted to say thank you so much for your time today. And it's been an absolute joy talking to you.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic. And I'm so excited to see the rest of your podcast and how it turns out. I'll be an avid listener.
Oh, thank you so much. Our next episode, to let you know, is actually we're going to be talking all about ADHD. So that's going to be a beautiful conversation.
My other favourite topic. Fantastic. I can't wait.
Have an amazing day, Helen. Thank you so much.
Yes, you too. Have a great weekend. Thanks, Carly. Bye.
Thank you. Be sure to check the show notes on our website for any links and references. You can find us at youcangrowyourownway.podbean.com. And if you found this episode helpful, we would love you to help us get the word out. You can share the podcast, tell a friend, and be sure to click the follow or subscribe button so you can access all our new episodes. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, where we would love to connect with you. You Can Grow Your Own Way recognises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of this place, now known as Australia. We're coming to you from Jabberung, Jawajali and Wadawurrung country, the country of our guest speaker, and from wherever you are listening. We respect the elders of the past and present, and we share our friendship and kindness.